So could you talk a little bit about that, about getting everything in place so you're ready to play and comfortable and doing all of that?
Sure.
Yeah.
For me at least, and what I find most successful in teaching is finding a center in the body.
Uh-huh.
If you think of the flute going off center, and what it takes to hold it there, and if I play a platinum flute, so I have a very heavy flute actually, and if I just think about picking the flute up and holding it, then my arms and hands are doing all the work.
Sure.
And I probably wouldn't be able to play such a heavy instrument if I allowed that to happen.
Uh-huh.
So finding a center of gravity is a super important thing. I like to say to my students, you sit tall and stand low.
Uh-huh.
I like that feeling of you're sitting, so you're grounded already because you're sitting, and then kind of defying gravity in that way, coming up from your feet, and upward into the top like a puppet.
Right. Yeah.
A marionette that would be pulled at the
Sure.
top and just supported naturally in that way. Because I think that there is really not a perfect way to stand and play the flute or sit and play the flute. I think it's again an individual thing. I think I've done some Alexander training, and so I'm real hip to that sort of thinking. Having said that, I don't adhere to it when I play the flute. I think this kind of straight on with the feet idea, the legs bent a little bit, the knees kind of released, unlocked, is great for some people. And when you pick up the flute and you do that, it really sets you straight off. And it hurts my right shoulder.
Yeah.
It just hurts. It does not hurt many people's right shoulders. A lot of people swear by it, and I think it's a really valuable way to approach posture and lifting. But for me, it just pulls me
you
back.
look uncomfortable when you're doing that.
And I feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So feeling that this is kind of more of an axis in the body, a central axis, and instead of putting my feet straight on, feeling that I have a little bit more of a V shape.
Right.
Slightly more of a V shape, and then the flute can kind of ride the middle, so to
Yeah.
speak. And so that involves a little twist in the upper body, but that also kind of makes the flute more centered on the body.
Yeah.
Human beings need air. So we say the wind players need the air, but just humans in general just need air.
Sure.
And so we're all expert breathers, actually. And you're an expert breather, I can see it, and I am too sitting here. Now, a funny thing happens when you pick this up is that you go, I don't know how to breathe.
Yeah.
And the truth be told is, of course you do. And babies, know how to do it. So if we can kind of just imitate life when we play our instruments, then we're way ahead of the game.
Well, of course, part of that idea is promulgated by teachers who tell their students they don't know how to breathe.
Right, that's true. And part of it is, if you'll pardon me for pointing an accusatory finger, occasionally I must, it's all good intentions gone wrong. So you have a certain segment of maybe band directors or teachers telling their students, sit up, sit up, sit up, which is good, sit up by all means. But what ends up happening with an earnest, hoping student is that they sit up. They sit up and their flutes are perfectly straight and their shoulders are up and they are at attention, and they're commended for that. And what ends up happening is that center of gravity just flies out the window and the tension starts creeping in.
Yeah.
So then you say, take a big breath to that student, they say, and they get higher up. And so everything's kind of gone off kilter for them. So I think the idea of sit up is great, but at what expense, kind of.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of, I like to think of this idea of, the lower half of the body is grounded, the gravitational pull, it's making you powerful, you're checked into that channel, and the top half of the body is defying it. Is just saying, oh, you won't pull me down, we'll work this way. So there's a certain north-south angle in the body. Now, once you have that, of course, then you're open in this area. And if you're open in this area, that means that you have the capacity then, the ability, the potential to fill your lung sacs.
Yeah.
And if you're not, then you're probably going to go to here, because this is where the tension starts, and that's as much of your lung as you'll get filled.
Yeah.
And that's why students run out of breath so quickly. If you think about your rib cage, where your rib cage is, it's all the way down here. And although I'm not an anatomy expert, I do believe the lungs travel quite far south, and they have that potential, and into the back, into the sides, so that if you're open here, in other words, just let it hang out kind of, then you have the ability to breathe from low. and then you become Superman-esque or
Yeah.
Superwoman-esque,
Yeah.
and you
Uh-huh.
have, kind of a broadening and a elevating feeling without bringing tension into
Yeah.
it. And, we say you are what you eat, right? We say that, and I always say your tone is what you breathe.
Uh-huh.
So if you breathe in, a kind of an E sound and shape, then that's the sound you're going to put out. If
Uh-huh.
you nourish your oxygen, you take in round oxygen, or I like the shape HU when I blow out,
Uh-huh.
hoo, and if I breathe in HU, then I don't have to modify that.
Yeah.
I don't have to take a breath and then blow out in a different way. It's just, it's cohesive.
And tell me just your standard embouchure shtick.
Well, perhaps the best thing to know about my standard operating
Uh-huh.
shtick is that I perhaps don't have quite such a standard operating
Uh-huh.
shtick. It's really based on the individual, my whole concept.
Uh-huh.
Having said that, there are certain basic premises that I think we generally adhere to.
Uh-huh.
And it really is, I use the word structure, and I like that
Huh,
word
uh-huh.
for it. So that we have, if we have no structure, for instance, let's go at it from that direction,
Yeah.
then we could at least interfere with what I call the embouchure, the center of the mouth.
Uh-huh.
So if there is no structure and it's entirely loose here, you blow that forward,
Uh-huh.
which is what you often hear in beginning flutes.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, that kind of wide open sound without kind of finesse or sophistication to
Uh-huh.
it.
Uh-huh.
So the basic idea of loose everywhere is a great idea. Having said that, the most important aspect to me, at least one of the most important aspects, is the connection, the contact we make here. For instance, I spoke earlier about the full contact with a brass instrument
Right,
and
sure.
reed contact internally.
Uh-huh.
We don't get any of that. So we have to make our connection to make our voice entirely from here.
Yeah.
And so I'm always convinced that that's why we have this little nook and cranny here, so that we can snuggle the flute in.
That's it.
Under the bottom lip, actually, not on the bottom lip,
Uh-huh.
is my philosophy. Again,
Yeah.
that's up for grabs, but depending on lip size, certainly an average lip size, the flute can sit very nicely just under the lip, and that gives you total freedom
Uh-huh.
to make your connection all the way east-west,
Huh.
so to speak, on the lip
Uh-huh.
plate.
Yeah.
So that connection, when you do that, anybody that frowns at all, even slightly makes that contact, you can feel what happens to your muscles.
Sure.
Without that, you're loose.
Uh-huh.
But when you do this suddenly, there is a little structure that comes in on the
Uh-huh.
sides. So that's the first premise, is that you make as much connection and contact as possible, and that's how these head joints are cut. They're cut for that sort of connection so that you're angling your air in at the proper
Yeah.
angle.
Uh-huh.
Actually thinking so centrally about the musculature in the mouth and the top lip
Yeah,
and the bottom lip can really inhibit some
Right,
students,
right.
actually. So in order to really have that conversation, I like to say the sound comes from within,
Yeah.
and lastly through the flute.
Sure.
So for me, this idea of opening up the diaphragm and the lower back is where I would put my heft or
Yeah.
my center,
Uh-huh.
which kind of takes away from the focus on any kind of muscles.
Uh-huh.
Now, having said that, I feel these muscles are very loose
Uh-huh.
because I like to feel the air swirling in my mouth.
Right.
The mouth being a great resonance chamber.
Yeah.
The last point of resonance.
Yeah.
We're making resonance all the way down through our bodies, through our entire lungs,
Uh-huh.
through the rib cage, into every area of the body, in the abdomen and the back. But this is kind of our last departure point.
Right.
So feeling any tension in here that would press the cheeks down would inhibit that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, my thought about articulation and where my tongue lives is that
Uh-huh.
it lives where it likes to live,
Uh-huh.
which is to say where it is right now. The tip of my tongue is generally down in my mouth. I'm not pulling it there, but it's
Yeah.
just relaxed there. And the back of my tongue lives a little bit higher.
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of the times we're taught the opposite on the flute, especially in the 70s. We were all about da-ga.
Uh-huh.
For a double tongue articulation,
Yeah.
da. If you say da, you can feel that the tip of the tongue is quite high in the mouth, really not even close to the teeth, really just on the roof of the mouth.
Uh-huh.
And da brings the back of the tongue down, which if you sit there and we do it for 5 seconds together, tip up and back down, it hurts.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So that's your number one clue, is what feels good, what feels natural. I mean, let's not fight City Hall. That's my attitude about playing the flute, you know?
Yeah.
Let's figure out what the body wants to do and decide whether, in fact, it can work on the flute.
Sure.
And I think the tongue wants to live a little bit more this way, with the tip a little bit further down, at least on the back of the tongue. Is that where yours feels comfortable?
Yeah, exactly, sure.
Sure, I think that, you know, I could poll 100 people and they would say that.
Right.
Now, having said that, forward is where it's all about in articulation for me. I've changed from my style of da to more of a t, which is super forward.
Yeah.
A ta is, I suppose, okay. I don't use D sounds very often in articulation. I think there's a time and a place for it. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater on that one. It's a little bit more of a muffled articulation, but the idea of having a real crisp forward articulation with the tip of the tongue, or even just behind the tip of the tongue, is maybe even more honest. If you say two, or you say t, they're slightly different.
They are, yeah.
Two is a little more tensed and straighter maybe, and t is a little softer, a little wetter.
Yeah.
You can hear it in the word, and it's not really the very tip of my tongue. It's just behind the tip of my tongue. So there's a certain ding to the sound when you do it that way. If I do a straight duh, it seems to fall flat.
There's more of a bang at the front of the note.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the idea is to, again, kind of think from the bottom up with the playing and letting the air come through the channel in here as naturally as possible.
Can you describe where your tongue is in relationship to your teeth when you're doing that articulation?
I absolutely can. And this is just a personal where
Right,
it is.
sure.
I have a bit of an overbite, and I think, you know, again, that depends on how your mouth is structured, and I don't think there's a one way. I think there's a good concept, and I think the good concept is forward. So having said that, I think the tip of my tongue is absolutely kind of in love with the back of my bottom teeth, and even a little bit connected to the touching, tapping, maybe a little bit to the bottom of my top teeth. But really, I don't want it too much on my top teeth, because that's where my air has to come through, right through the teeth. So the idea that I'm almost anchoring it. And I sometimes have my students do this in their lessons, and they all think it's very geeky, but the idea that if your tongue is slightly anchored, and I don't mean with tension, I just mean it's resting. They like each other, these bottom teeth and the tongue. It's resting there, then you don't have to actually move the tongue. You don't have to lizard it, is what I call it. You can rest it there and say, and it's not, the tongue is really not coming back. It's just kind of, it's hanging out.
And it seems like your tongue is kind of in the shape, and correct me if this is an inappropriate interpretation of that, it's kind of in the shape of what it would be if you said U, I mean U with an umlaut, and just low there. And the tip is sort of just against your bottom teeth.
It is. U is a gorgeous thing to conceptualize on the flute. I'm glad you reminded me about that. But it really is and the shapes that the lips take with that as well is a beautiful shape for an aperture.
Great. So could you tell me in what instances you choose to initiate the sound with your tongue between your lips and when you don't?
Oftentimes that would be the first way I would choose to articulate in a passage. The very first articulation, it helps to open that center of the lips and wet the lips too. I suffer from a lot of allergies, so I'm dry a lot of the time due to either the medication or the actual allergy. So sometimes just kind of sets everything in motion. Enhances kind of the shape.
So that's only really the initial tone that you're articulating with the tongue between your lips.
There really some time after that. If I did, I would have a snaky face, you know. And it really would break the line instead of, you know, help the line propel.
Sure.
Then I think it recedes.
Great. When you are making adjustments in your embouchure, what kinds of things are you compensating for when you play?
Well, it's another great question, and You have to remember that when I grew up, actually, in my early years on the flute in the, I guess that would be the 70s, the style of playing them was a little different than it is now, and the concept of embouchure was different, and tonal production. And there was much more emphasis put on more smiley, pull corners, and really setting in this way. So that's the way I learned, and that's the way I lived for a long time. I changed my embouchure all by myself at age 30, actually, with a little mirror from your local pharmacy that I put on my stand and just looked at it all the time. And I thought, now why do I sound like this and all the flute players I like sound like that? And I started to look at myself and say, well, gee, I'm doing this and they're not. And I'm doing, a number of things. And so the adjustments that I make, I'm modifying still at this point in my career, because I think that the way I approached the instrument as a child was with a lot of movement and a lot of modification for register, for dynamic range, for all sorts of issues like that. And now I've started to really understand in the last 10 years that less is in fact more, and that really we're only a 3-octave instrument. And I like to tell my students, I like to go over to the keyboard and show them we play basically from here to here, and there's all of this left in the treble clef and all of this left in the bass clef. So we think low C and then high C, but in fact they're neighbors really in the extent of range. And so there is really very little movement required in order to sound great in all registers. Having said that, there is probably some useful movement. The low register tends to speak more richly if you still stay with your connection in your bottom lip, but you let the top lip float forward more, so that what you're doing is channeling air more directly down. So I like to say to my students, for the low register, you're really putting your air to your left foot big toe. Or a shark face is another way I think of it. It's just having that kind of forward snout. And that's typically the only kind of adjustment that I conceptualize. And then from there, it's just still bottom lip, and the top lip can just kind of get back into the natural placement for the rest of the registers.
So when you're making those adjustments with the upper lip, especially in the low register, are you doing anything with the flute, or is the flute pretty much still and the lip is what's making the adjustment?
Hopefully the flute is stable, which is why I like a low placement here rather than an on the lip placement, because an on the lip placement bobbles for me, and because it bobbles because this is fleshy, and it's going to move. So if you really tuck the flute kind of under and up so that it's set in there, then the flute can really kind of stay in position. Also, I think a lot of adjustments are made internally rather than externally. There are a couple of schools of thought on that. Some people really make broad adjustments here, and they maintain the integrity of their tone from a low note to
a high note. And when you say here, do you mean like moving the jaw? Or
jaw, lips, that sort of thing, just kind of pulling back and forth, and they're able to maneuver through that really successfully. Again, I use the diaphragm. I use my internal placement for a lot of that.
That's an interesting thing, because I know that many people who are starting beginners talk a lot about making huge changes to the angle of the airstream by rolling the flute and moving your head and moving your jaw, and much of which is engaging the body in ways that seem just much more unnatural than it needs to be. So do you find that you encounter students who've had that approach? I mean, do you have ways that you've adopted to get them to be less involved physically while they're just playing through the 3 registers of the flute? How do you approach them?
I think that most students actually approach that way, and I think it might be the way they're taught early on, and it might just be the difficulty. It is hard to get the low register out when you're a young student, because you don't really understand structuring. So, that kind of loose gives you that Coke bottle.
I know that sound.
Tone, And so I think most of my students actually are doing more work than is necessary, at least. So we do a lot of diaphragm work, which is to say we take the tongue out of it, out of the sound, and we take the sustaining out, and we just through our instruments form an embouchure, and we say either HU or HA, something like that. Because then you'll start to understand that it doesn't take much here to actually make the sound.
Yeah.
It's about the channel, keeping the free flow in the channel. I mean, a couple of great rules of thumb to live by are, to have your jaw dropped, just feel like there's space. And I prefer to think of the back of my mouth as being open rather than dropping the front of my mouth.
Yeah.
In my experience, when I ask a student to really drop their jaw and they do that kind of in a physical way, they pull.
Yeah.
To do it. And so here I don't think it's so beneficial for the flute to do that. I like to create space between my back teeth, which then, disengages or drops the jaw,
Sure.
call it what you will, and lips forward. So if you have this concept of the space and lips forward, you have 50% of your setup really in place. Simple as that may sound, I think the other 50% is the internal mechanism, the idea of starting the tone low. But I think a drop jaw or space between the back teeth and forward lips. When you bring your lips forward, you bring your lips forward, they start to take a shape.
Yeah.
And that's your embouchure shape.
Yeah.